Build skills with experts anytime, anywhere. Get certified, get ahead. The world's largest selection of courses, affordable online courses and learning opportunities, top categories.
Tool is Jenkins because it's got an ecosystem of plugins that can run on any platform. Jenkins pipelines are powerful because they can be used to create intricate deployment processes that can be maintained and versioned alongside application code. This course is meant for DevOps or software engineers who want to script pipelines to build, test, and deploy their containerized applications to a Kubernetes cluster. We'll be covering how to build Docker containers, run unit tests and container scanning tools, and finally to deploy to a Kubernetes cluster using Jenkins pipelines. Some of the major topics that we'll cover include the syntax and features of Jenkins pipeline code, using open source container scanning tools, creating reusable shared libraries to use with Jenkins pipelines, and using flow control steps and conditions to control deployments. By the end of this course, you'll know how to write Jenkins continuous integration and deployment pipelines and deploy your applications from a version control system like Git. Before beginning this course, you should be familiar with the basic Jenkins concepts and very comfortable using the command line. I hope you'll join me on this journey to learn about continuous deployment pipelines with the Building a Modern CI/CD Pipelines with Jenkins course at Plural. Things first, we're going to be building our pipeline with scripted pipelines. So we're going to cover a little bit of Scripted Pipelines 101. To do that, we need to go over how to configure Jenkins integration with GitHub. And then, because there's so many different ways you can write your pipelines, I want to make sure that you know where to find the scripted pipeline documentation. Finally, we're going to go ahead and run a sample Hello World pipeline, just to see it all in action. So some of the things we're not going to do here are set up Jenkins from start to finish. I'm assuming that you already have at least a basic installation of Jenkins CI/CD server somewhere. So if you don't, there's a couple of courses here that can get you started, like Getting Started with Jenkins 2. And this is a good resource to actually install and configure your initial Jenkins setup. We'll go over a few of the settings that we need to for this course, but for the most part, I'm assuming you've done this already. Next, I'd recommend Groovy Getting Started. This may seem like a bit of an odd one, but actually Jenkins scripted pipelines are written in a Groovy-based DSL. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, Groovy is kind of like Java Lite. It's based on Java classes and uses a lot of the same syntax, but it's a dynamic language, which means you don't have to compile it before you execute it. You don't need to know a ton of Groovy for this course, just the basic syntax will get you by. We'll go over more detailed stuff later on. For now, if you're interested, check out this course. And finally, continuous integration and continuous delivery, the big picture. This kind of gives you a sense of what the best practices are to start building pipelines. We're going to be diving into some specific Jenkins pipelines here, but this will give you an overview of what you can shoot for and what kinds of things you can achieve with this framework. So our course pipeline is actually going to be pretty simple. We're going to take a GitHub repository with an already constructed app, and we're going to create a pipeline that, without making any changes to the code itself, will build the containers for the application and then run those containers through a variety of testing suites, in this case Anchor and Trivy, which are two container scanning applications. And finally, once those scans are done, we're going to deliver it to a Kubernetes cluster. This should be a super interesting course, and I'm really looking forward to it. So let's get started. So Jenkins can be set up any number of ways and with several different configurations. I've seen it done with several different source code plugins, deployment styles over Windows and Linux. You know, my wife likes to joke that Jenkins is what happened when the Ask Jeeves guy went into witness protection. And I disagree with that because instead of just serving web pages, Jenkins does pretty much everything for you as long as it's configured properly. So in this section of the course, we're going to look at how we're going to configure Jenkins for this course and for scripted pipelines, and we're going to look at how the GitHub integration is set up. So first things first, if you've played with Jenkins at all, or if you've set up any jobs, you've probably set up freestyle jobs. And these are a little bit different than scripted pipelines in a number of ways. For example, with freestyle jobs, you've probably configured them through the UI, whereas with scripted pipelines, you're configuring them through code. Instead of clicking through a bunch of manual windows, you're defining your build instructions alongside your application code. Also, with freestyle jobs, none of your changes are really tracked. There's plugins that Jenkins can use to address some of that, but really, they're not very robust and they leave a lot to be desired. With scripted pipelines, you track all of your changes to each build instruction through source control, as you do with your application code. Another difference with freestyle jobs, if you need to move them to a different Jenkins server or change hardware, you're pretty much recreating them from scratch. With Jenkins scripted pipelines, you just import the new pipeline wherever you want it to be. Another difference is with freestyle jobs, you need a separate job for each step in the pipeline. It's actually a best practice using a series of freestyle jobs to use a different step for each significant step in the pipeline, like build, test, or deploy, and then put them all downstream from one another. And that way you know if your pipeline fails, where it fails, and how to address it. With scripted pipelines, all of that's built in, and you have the additional benefit of being able to parameterize these scripts and using them for different applications so long as they share similar build steps. We'll go into that later in the course as well. And finally, creating and configuring freestyle jobs is a very manual process. I remember one of my first jobs when I got into DevOps in the first place was setting up a series of freestyle jobs that took me a couple of months to actually get through. Whereas pipelines, they can be pretty much automatically generated, and we'll go into that a little bit more as the course goes on. But a lot of what you'll see in scripted pipelines is programmatically already set up, and you just need to tweak it for your needs. So one more thing before we continue on. There are some very specific definitions when referring to the Jenkins documentation. So we're going to cover some of that here. First and foremost, a pipeline is a series of tasks required to build, test, or deploy an application. So this is start to finish your process on how do you get your application from source control into production. The next term you'll hear a lot in this course is agent. And an agent in Jenkins terminology defines which Jenkins build agent should run the pipeline. So for example, if you have an application that you need to build on Windows and Linux, you'll have an agent for each of those and then be able to run that pipeline on both of those agents depending on how you want to build it or test your application. The next term I want you to know is a stage, and that is a section of the pipeline, such as build or test. And finally, a step in each stage is the specific instructions to execute the stage. Now, if you don't get all this now, don't worry, this will make a lot more sense once we start getting into the code, but it's important to have these definitions because the Jenkins documentation will refer to each of these as such. Speaking of the Jenkins documentation, there are several different ways to set up Jenkins. I'm not going to pretend to be able to cover them all in the course. It would go on for far too long if I could cover every technology and every plugin. Instead, here are some links to the Jenkins pipeline documentation. And this is very good for how to configure and set up Jenkins pipelines to do things other than deploy to Kubernetes or run unit testing or any other tips and tricks you might want to implement in your pipelines. Second is your pipeline syntax. Now the pipeline syntax for Jenkins is very specific. I mentioned it's a Groovy DSL, but it's not strictly Groovy. There are some tips and tricks to it. If you run vanilla Groovy, but try to run that same code in a Jenkins pipeline, it's going to break. So consult this when you need to insert a step into your Jenkins pipeline. And finally, there's a pipeline steps document here that has a list of pipeline compatible plugins and how to generate steps for them. I mentioned earlier that these steps can be automatically generated, and this document here has quite a number of them already written out. So if you have something that you want to build into a Jenkins pipeline, check here and see if that plugin has a pre-built pipeline step for you to use already. All right, in this demo, we're going to go over how to set up GitHub integration with Jenkins. I imagine this is something you all already have done, but just to be safe, I'll go over it anyways. If you have done it or you know how to do it, just skip that step. And second, I'm going to go over the scripted pipelines plugin and how to start using it. All right, let's cut over to our first demo of the course. So first thing, we're going to take a look at the app we're going to be using for this course. This is an Azure voting demo app that runs on Kubernetes. It lends itself very well to a Kubernetes style deployment. And you'll see there's even a Jenkins tutorial folder here. If we click on this and take a look at one of the shell scripts, it's not really a Jenkins file. These are just really shell scripts that install the necessary tools. We're going to ignore these for now and set up our own Jenkins pipeline to use this. But if we go under Azure Vote, there's actually a Docker file here. There's some application code. If we go back to the root of the repository, we'll see that there's an all-in-one vote YAML, and this looks like a Kubernetes deployment manifest. So part of the goal for this course is that we don't want to make any changes to the application code. If you're a DevOps engineer that's going to be supporting developers or supporting a team of developers, we don't want to make any changes to their code to get it to run better. We just want to get it deployed as is, but in a safe and secure manner. So this is the app that we'll be using. I forked it to my personal account here, and I'll show you why in just a minute. Let's switch over to my profile settings. All right, so I'm here in the public profile page for my GitHub account, and under developer settings, personal access tokens, you see we've got a couple of tokens here, but we want to set one up for Jenkins as well. We're going to generate a new token, and we're going to call it Jenkins. Now we could give this a lot of different permissions. I don't want to give more permissions to Jenkins than it needs though. So let's go over to Jenkins and see exactly what it needs for GitHub integration. Okay, I'm here at my local Jenkins instance, and the first thing I'm going to do is click on Manage Jenkins on the left-hand side. Now if we scroll down here to Configure System, and then scroll a little bit further down here to the GitHub section, we're going to add a new GitHub server. Now it's already got the API URL for GitHub plugged in, so we're just going to go ahead and call this our GitHub connection. And under credentials, let's click on the question mark on the right-hand side here. If you ever have any questions about Jenkins settings, that question mark usually has the answer for you. So it says to register with GitHub, we need our token to have the admin repo hook, repo, and repo status scopes. So let's go back to GitHub and set up our token. So back here in GitHub, I've set up the token, I've set up the scopes. Let's go ahead and generate the token. And here it is. Let's copy it off for now. You're only going to see it once, so make sure you save this off. Let's go back over to Jenkins and plug it in. So back here on Jenkins, I'm going to add a new Jenkins credential, and we're going to use the secret text kind, plug in our secret text, and I've already got one here with GitHub token because I was playing around with this earlier, so we're going to call this GitHub connection. Let's click add, and then if we go under credentials, we have GitHub connection here. Let's minimize that so we can see a little better. And I'll go ahead and test the connection, and it works. So now let's save that and continue on with our setup. So I'm here in my Jenkins instance, and we're going to go back into Manage Jenkins to take a look at this. Now check out here under Manage Plugins. You see I've just done my updates here, so the course is going to be, at least for now, on the latest versions of all of these. But let's go ahead and check out the installed plugins. And go ahead and filter this page to just pipeline. So there's a lot here, but if we just go down a little bit, you'll see that the Jenkins pipeline plugin is already installed. And there's some other things that we can use here to extend our pipelines. but the basic pipeline plugin that has everything we need for this course is already here. So if you expand that a little bit, it will take you to the plugin page and give you some of the documentation and syntax reference that I mentioned earlier in the course. But it'll also take you to the GitHub page for the plugin. Since Jenkins is an open source project, all the plugins for it are open source as well. So you can go and take a look at the code anytime you need. For now, let's go back to our presentation and talk a little bit more about scripted pipelines and how to use them. So now that we've connected GitHub with Jenkins, let's take a look at the scripted pipeline itself. In this section of the course, we're going to go over how to actually create a scripted pipeline job, a hello world for scripted pipelines, if you will, and go over some of the basic syntax that you'll need to set up a pipeline and run it. So just to give you an idea of how to use Jenkins files and how to include a scripted pipeline with your code, we're going to take a look here at a sample of a GitHub repository. Really, it's a mock of a GitHub repository. You've got your application code, your README, git ignore, maybe a Kubernetes configuration, some other stuff, and a Docker file. Well, the Jenkins file, which is going to contain your scripted pipeline, is going to live at the root of your GitHub repository in a separate file called Jenkins file. And this can be changed, but by default, that's what it's called. And this is what Jenkins is going to look for when you import a job from GitHub with a scripted pipeline. To look at a little bit more of the detail of what is in a scripted pipeline file, this is it. This is the Hello World pipeline we're going to run a little bit later in the demo. And you remember back in the last section I said that syntax was very important and that certain words had a very strict definition. This has all of them here. So we have our pipeline, which is the complete script from beginning to end. And then agent. In this case, we're not specifying an agent. We're just saying it can run on any agent. You do have to include an agent block in your pipeline, but it's important to know that you can specify that this can run in a Docker container or run on a specific node. There's several different ways to configure this, but it is a required block in the pipeline. And next we have our stages block, and we'll go into this in the next slide a little bit more, but each pipeline is going to have more than one stage, and each stage is going to have one or more steps. So in this case, we've only got one stage, and that is our Hello World stage. And we've got one step in that stage, which is to just return Hello World. This is a pretty simple example. They will get infinitely more complicated as the course goes on, but having this basic framework will allow you to understand the rest of them a lot more. We can include more than one stage in our pipeline by just adding another stage block after the first one. So we have our build stage in this example with whatever the steps for the build process are. And then we have a test stage in the pipeline with whatever steps we need to test it. Those will run one after the other. And if one fails, let's say, for example, build fails in this case, test won't run and Jenkins will return an error. Again, this will make a little bit more sense as we get along in the course, but this is a good thing to keep in mind when you're talking about building a scripted pipeline. All right, in this demo, we're going to run a Hello World scripted pipeline as well as see where we can find some of the generated steps that we can put in later stages in our demos. Let's get started. So back here in Jenkins, this is a fresh instance, the same one we were using in the last demo. First thing we're going to do is create a new job. And you'll see there's a couple of different types of Jenkins jobs that we can set up here. In this course, we're primarily going to be focusing on the pipeline type of job and the multi-branch pipeline type of job. The only difference between these two is that the multi-branch pipeline will go and scan your Git repository for other branches and then use that pipeline on those other branches. We'll get into how to use these later on in the course. For now, we're going to just create a regular pipeline job. And since every job has to have a name, we're going to call this one Hello Pipeline. Once that's done, click OK. Okay, now we've got a few other options here. These are most of the same ones as you'll find in the freestyle jobs. but the real part we're interested in is down here under pipeline. Now there's two ways that you can do this. You can either use a pipeline script, which we can generate and input here, or we can use a pipeline from SCM. If you take a look, the script path is set to Jenkins file, which is at the root of our GitHub repository. This is configurable, but it's best practice to leave it at the default. We're going to, for now, go back to the pipeline script and try the sample Hello World pipeline. So you see this is the same one we had in the slides earlier. I'm just going to save this and then click Build Now. And this is not going to take very long to run at all. There we go. You'll see we have one block called Hello. That is our stage. Each other stage is appended to this screen as we add more and more of them. But we can get these logs from that by hovering over this block here and clicking on Logs. And we'll see the Hello World message that was printed from the step in that pipeline stage. The other thing we can do is go under the job here and look at the console output. And you'll see we actually have a little bit more of a breakdown here. We have the pipeline stage, the stage name, which was hello, and then the echo hello world step in that pipeline. So let's go back to the pipeline and make some changes and see what happens. If we want to add another stage here, let's take a copy of this first one, and we'll call this one Goodbye. And we'll just have this one echo hello world, then goodbye world. So let's save this and run our new pipeline. All right, we have the hello and goodbye stages now. You see goodbye happens right after hello. And if we look at the logs, it's got the goodbye world message in that stage, but not the hello world message that was in the stage before. And the same is reflected if we go into the console output. There's a shortcut here. If you click on the blue dot on the left here, it will take you straight to the console output instead of having to go to the job run and then to the console output. But you'll see we've got the same thing here. We've got the hello and goodbye stages running one after the other. We also have the ability to restart from a stage. So if we click on restart from stage and specify that we want to start the pipeline at the goodbye stage. This might be if a build fails or something like that and you have a very long build step that you want to skip. We can then go into that build and then to console output, and we'll see that it only ran the goodbye stage. It skipped the hello stage because we restarted it from the second stage. So let's go back into our pipeline configuration. There's one more section I want to show you here under pipeline syntax. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. You can actually generate snippets of pipeline code based on what plugins are installed in your Jenkins system. So for example, I have the PowerShell plugin installed on my Jenkins system. So if I want to execute a PowerShell command like write output, then I'd just enter that here. And then when we click the generate pipeline script, you'll see that we have a PowerShell command, but it's not the way we would typically expect to see it. Let's copy this for now and then go back to our pipeline script. Now, if I want to add another stage here that's hello from PowerShell, and instead of using the echo command, which is a generic shell command, we're going to use that PowerShell script that was generated for us in the last step. Now let's save this and run the pipeline again. Great, looks like that ran with no issues. You can see here we're using the PowerShell script plugin from Jenkins instead of the print message that we had in the last stage. If we go over to the console output, we don't really see much of a difference, just that it's running the PowerShell plugin on the step right before the output. And in this way, you can really customize these pipelines to do anything you need them to do. Now that we've seen the pipeline run, let's add the Jenkins file to our Git repository. So I'm here in my Azure Voting App repository, and the first thing I'm going to do actually is create a new file at the root here called Jenkins file. And for now, we're just going to copy and paste the code from our previous job. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. So this is the same code we had in the last demo, but I'm going to make some changes to it. Instead of doing hello, goodbye, and PowerShell hello, I want to actually get some specific information that I can use to make sure that I'm running this on my Git branch. So that's actually the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this hello stage to a verify branch stage. And instead of echoing hello world, I'm just going to echo the environment variable for Git branch. And we can remove all these other stages for now. Now it's important to note that you're not going to have this by default. In fact, Jenkins will insert a number of environment variables at runtime. It's how it does a lot of the configuration behind the scenes. It will set environment variables based on what settings you have in your Jenkins configuration at runtime. So in the specific case of Git or GitHub, it will actually create this Git branch environment variable for us to use if you're running from a Git branch. So let's save this, and then I'm going to break a couple of rules here and just commit directly to master so we can show this and move on the demo. Great, now let's go over to Jenkins. So I'm back here in my Jenkins console, and I'm going to create a new pipeline job for this. So let's go up to New Item, select Pipeline, and we'll call this Voting App Pipeline. Now that we're in the pipeline configuration for this project, we can specify that this is a GitHub project and provide a GitHub URL. And then if we scroll down, we're going to leave the build triggers alone. We don't want to build every commit just yet, but under pipeline script, instead of making this a script that I copy and paste like we did in the last one, I'm going to use the pipeline script from SCM. And I'll also have to specify that this is a Git project and provide the repository URL here as well. Now, because this is a public project, we should be able to run it from here. So I'll go ahead and click Save. And then if we click on Build Now, you'll see that the first thing it does is check out source code, but then our verify branch step failed. Let's see what happened here. Oh, I forgot to put it in quotes. That's what happened. So let me go fix that off camera, and then I'll run this again. Okay, that's better. That ran now. And if we go to the console output for that job and scroll down a little bit, we see the branch name did get printed. So that was just a minor fix there. Let's go back to the job. And because we specified a GitHub URL for this earlier, I can actually go straight to the repository from this job. And you can see that the file I changed right here. So that was the fix, just adding quotes to line 7. All right, let's wrap this module up and go to the summary. So now that our GitHub and Jenkins integration is done, we're going to start by building the container that we're going to deploy. And to do that, we're going to introduce how to run shell scripts in pipelines. After that, we're going to do some unit testing on the application, and we'll introduce the concept of the multi-branch pipeline and post steps. In our case, we're going to see about setting up post steps to notify us of a successful build or a failed build and take different actions from there. So here's our course pipeline, and we've just finished integrating GitHub with Jenkins. We're going to stay in GitHub for a little while and take a look at what else we can do with the pipeline code. Now this is the scripted pipeline that we ran in our demo. It's a simple hello world, but it's a little bit confusing if you're new to scripted pipelines because this echo command is not actually running a shell command or a batch command echo. It's a step in the Jenkins pipeline syntax. So let's go into the documentation and take a look at it. So back here in the pipeline steps reference that I put a link to earlier, there's a bunch of different things here, but let's just search for echo. And we have a few different plugins, but here's the one we're using under pipeline basic steps. So if we click on that, You see, it's actually the echo pipeline command. It's not a shell script in itself. It's just taking a string and printing it. We have a few other options for running shell scripts. Let's go take a look at them. So back in pipeline steps reference, let's search for some other ways that we can run shell scripts in our pipeline scripts. Now I'm on a Windows 10 device running PowerShell core, and the executable for that is pwsh. So let's see if we search for pwsh. It takes us down to this pipeline nodes and processes section. If we go in there, we see we have a few different options to run shell scripts on our systems. So we have batch PowerShell and PowerShell core, of course, but we also have shell for Linux. So depending on what host machine or agent you're running this on, you might want to use a different command. Let's go back to the slides and we'll go into this a little bit further. So this is the Hello World step that we had in our demo script in the last module, but an equivalent to that on a Linux box or host would be this here, which is the shell step to run the script echo hello world. On this machine, since again I'm running Windows 10 with PowerShell core, it will look something like this, where it's using the pwsh pipeline step to run a write output commandlet using PowerShell core. If this doesn't make sense now, that's fine. We're going to do this a little bit more in the demo and go a little bit more hands-on. In this demo, we're going to build our Docker container by running shell scripts in our pipeline. Let's get started. I'm back in the GitHub repository for this project, and I've added another branch called add tests. So the problem with our current Jenkins job is that it's only running against the master branch. But for this example, I want to make sure that all of my testing, and in this case my Jenkins pipeline, is running on both branches. So let's go over to Jenkins and set up a multi-branch pipeline. So we're back in the Jenkins homepage, and the first thing I'm going to do is delete the voting app pipeline. We're not going to need this anymore. We're going to be replacing it with the multi-branch pipeline. So let's go up to new item, and we'll keep the same name, but instead of making this a regular pipeline, we'll make it a multi-branch pipeline. The first thing you want to do when setting up a multi-branch pipeline is configure your branch source. And this is the Git or GitHub or other version control repository with all of your code in it. In my case, it's GitHub, and I have the GitHub token as a username and password without the username, so it recognizes me for the credentials. And then I just have to provide the HTTPS URL to our repo. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. And we can click validate, see it's the right one. And we're going to keep the rest of this as default. We don't want to change too much for now. Note in build configuration, it's still using the Jenkins file and looking for it at the root of the repository. So let's go ahead and save this. And it's going to go through and check, and it found both of our branches, master and add tests. And the default behavior is to run through them both. Let's pause the video here, and I'll unpause when it's finished running. All right, it looks like our master branch has passed, which makes sense because it passed for us in the last section, but the add tests branch has failed. And I already know why it failed. I set it up to fail, but let's go ahead and take a look at the logs for it anyways. Now I added 3 new stages at the end of the master branch pipeline: the start test app, the run tests, and the stop test app stages. Let's dive into the code and I'll show you what each of these do and why it failed. So I'm back in Visual Studio Code in my Jenkins file, and it's got the 3 new stages here: start test app on line 22, run tests on line 38, and stop test app on line 45. Now you can tell from the stop test app stage that I'm expecting to have a Docker compose file here that starts and stops the application. And if you look in the repository on the left side, I do have a Docker compose file in my repository. What I'm missing in the start test app stage is the Docker compose up line. So it should have tried to start the app with Docker compose and then run this PowerShell script. This script is going to try and ping the container 3 times, and if it can't, it will just fail out. So we're going to go check the console output and see if that's what happened in just a moment. But before we leave here, note on line 4, I'm actually using an environment variable called stage name that I'm not setting anywhere. Jenkins sets certain variables at runtime for each pipeline. So whenever your stage is running, you have access to an environment variable called stage name. That's just the name of the stage in the pipeline. So we're going to see that in action in just a minute. Let's go over to our console output and make sure that this is what we're expecting to see. All right, we're here in the console log for the add tests branch. And right there in the middle, it says start test app, which is the stage name that failed. It tries to start the container 3 times, and then it goes straight to the post steps. So we know that's why our container's not starting, is because we forgot to add a start command. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code and add the command in. So as I mentioned in one of the previous videos, this repository does have a Docker Compose file, and we can use that Docker Compose file to spin up and spin down a test copy of the application. So let's add that into our Jenkins file and commit it to Git. We're going to do this the same way we would any other code change, which is really the power of these Jenkins files. I'll go ahead and speed the video up from here so you're not just watching me type. All right, let's go back to Jenkins. All right, if we hit build now, it'll run this one more time, and that should pick up our new commit and then run the rest of the pipeline. Let's pause the video and I'll resume it when it's finished. All right, looks like that finished running. I actually had to run it again because I did something a little foolish on my end. So let's go to the console output for that second run. And you'll see I actually forgot to include my unit test file from my local repository. So that's not a thing with the Jenkins pipeline. If we go to the next build, that test did run and it passed. So the pipeline is now green. You can also set up on the GitHub side to have this as a branch protection check to block any merging unless your test branch passes in Jenkins. In the next video, we're going to go over how to use post conditions so you can take different actions if your pipeline succeeds or fails. So I'm back in the pipeline syntax documentation, and some of you might have caught this in the last video, but we can also add post steps at the end of our build based on if the build was successful or failing. So here in the table of contents on the right side, there's a post section. Go over there, and you'll see we can set certain conditions in our pipeline. So if the build is successful, or if it's changed, or if you need something to always run regardless of the stage's success or failure, there's a condition for it here. Let's go take a look at what that looks like in the pipeline script. So I'm back here in the Jenkins file for my project, and you'll see I have a post section inside of the start test app stage, and I have 2 conditions in that stage. If it's a successful stage, if it passes without any issues, then I know the app has started successfully, Docker Compose works, and I want it to print app started successfully. But if it's a failure, I just print app failed to start, and we can look for these in the console output. So let's go back to our Jenkins console and take a look for them. Okay, so we have a couple of different builds to choose from here. The start test app failed in build number 1, so let's go to the console output for that first. And I also put some emojis in there, so we can just search for a smiley face and we don't find it. But search for a frowny face and it takes us right to the line in question, which is app failed to start. Let's go to the next successful build and see if we can find the success message. There we go. It says app started successfully. Now these are pretty simple examples. You can use them to send email if you have the email plugin set up, or Slack messages if you have the Slack integration plugin set up. You can get pretty creative with these, but this gives you a tool to be able to respond a little bit quicker to the status of your pipeline while you're running it. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up the module. To scan containers, we need to be able to get to them. And most container scanning solutions operate off of a registry. So the first thing we're going to cover is how to upload your container into a Docker registry. And the Jenkins pipeline concepts we're going to use to do this are script blocks and some of the more advanced Docker pipeline steps. We'll go into each of these a little more as the module goes on, but in essence, script blocks allow you to run blocks of Groovy code as a single script in your pipeline, whereas the Docker plugin allows you to work with containers in some ways you might not expect from a Jenkins pipeline. We're also going to set up 2 third-party scanning tools and integrating them into our pipeline. One is called Anchor, and the other is called Trivy. These are both open source products with enterprise licensing agreements if you choose to pay for them. But the reason that I picked these two is they're each a little bit different. Anchor, for example, has a plugin that you can interface with directly from the Jenkins pipeline, whereas Trivy you can install on your build agents and then run directly from there. And finally, since both of these take quite a bit of time and we do want to deliver the results to our developers a little bit faster, we're also going to learn how to set up parallel stages in a Jenkins pipeline. So these will run at the same time without being dependent on one another. So going back to the course pipeline graph we have here, this is where we're at in the third section here. We're going to run the Anchor and Trivy container scanners in parallel of each other after configuring them to run from our Jenkins pipeline. In this demo, we're going to just upload the container to a Docker registry, just a small task we need to do as a prerequisite before we go into scanning them. Let's get started. All right, welcome back to the course. I'm here in Docker Hub where I've actually put the Docker container repository for this course. You'll see now there's nothing in here. I did have something in here, but I deleted it just to illustrate the point. You see we've got these Docker push commands here on the right side. And if we wanted to, we could just run those with a shell step in our Jenkins pipeline, and that would upload the Docker container just fine. But we're going to see if we can use some of the advanced Docker features from the Docker pipeline plugin. Let's switch over to the Jenkins documentation. So I'm here in the pipeline syntax page, and we've been here a couple of times, but let's actually poke around a little bit. We've kind of just been where we needed to be to get the step done. Let's actually take a look around at some of these things. If we go one level up in the navigation here, you see we actually get to a full pipelines page here, and this has got a lot more documentation, a lot more information on how to use Jenkins files and Jenkins pipelines. A lot of it I've kind of gone over through the course so far. I don't typically like to cover documentation from start to finish because that's not what you're here to do. You're here to watch it happen. But it's useful to us now because we want to use some of the more advanced Docker features. So on the right side here, there's a section called Using Docker with Pipeline. Let's go ahead and navigate there. And this is just a few of the higher level Docker commands that you can use to customize your pipelines, including running your steps inside a Docker container or even running the whole pipeline inside a Docker container. If we scroll down to the bottom, there's a tag called Using a Custom Registry. So let's go there. That's the section we're interested in right now. You can just call methods on Docker without instantiating it, and then pass in a few parameters like image, registry, and credentials. Let's go over to Jenkins to take a look at it. So as you might imagine, the first thing we need to do in order to set up our Docker Hub push command is authenticate to the Docker registry. So since we're not using a Docker login command like we would interactively, we need to provide credentials somehow. Now Jenkins does have a way to pass credentials. It's over here on the left side in the credentials pane. Let's go over there for a minute. You see I've already got a few set up here, including Docker Hub, which is the ID of the username and password combination for my Docker account. And there's a couple of things that you can tell about it right off the bat. One, if we hover over this icon here, it says that it's a username and password. And two, it's got my username in plain text here, but not the password. If we actually click on that, there's not really a way for us to see my password in plain text. There's no passwords in plain text in Jenkins. So once you put your password in, it's stored securely and you don't have to go in and retrieve it unless you're changing it. So remember the ID Docker Hub, because that's going to become important when we actually take a look at the code for this. Let's go over to Visual Studio Code and see how that looks. Okay, so we're back in Visual Studio Code in the Jenkins file, and there's a lot going on here, so I'm going to break it down line by line. There's a lot of new stuff here for us to cover. I've got my stage push container, and that's something we've seen before. I'm opening the steps block on line 53, and then I'm going to use the echo command to say the workspace is workspace. That is one of the environmental variables that Jenkins injects into the project while we're running it. And a workspace in Jenkins terminology is the folder that our job is running in. So this will make a little bit more sense when I actually pull it up in the console later on, but for now, just know that that is the environmental variable for the workspace that we're going to run our job in. And in the next line, I've got a dir or dir command. And if you'll remember, we're not actually running a Docker file inside of our root directory. The Docker file for this application is under Azure Vote, which is a subdirectory of our root directory. So we could change to it in a shell script and then run a Docker build command from there. But since we wanted to use some of the lesser known features, we can actually just use a dir block and then specify the directory we want to run it in. And each command in that dir block will run from that directory. On the next line, I have a script block, and script blocks are really just a way to run Groovy code as a single script instead of having to define it line by line. So if I wanted to write just a quick Groovy script or call some Groovy functions as I'm going to do with this Docker command, then that's where I'd do it. And that way it'll evaluate them all at the same time rather than try and do it line by line. And then finally, I'm calling my Docker plugin with the registry index.docker.io. That's the default URL for this plugin, but it's also the URL for Docker Hub. And then the next parameter I'm passing in is actually Docker Hub, which if you'll remember is the ID for the Jenkins credentials we want to use to log in. It's not the username or password, it's the ID for the credentials from the Jenkins system. And that'll let Jenkins know that we want to use the credentials pair with that ID to execute this command. But then from there, we're using the Docker build command and storing that in the image variable. For those of you who are not familiar, def is the keyword to define a variable in Groovy. Once we have that Docker build step running, we can just run an image.push, and that will push the image that we've just built up to the Docker registry. Let's go back to Jenkins and take a look at it running. Okay, so I'm back in my Jenkins UI, and I ran this before I started the video back up, and that's because you don't need to really watch this. You've seen it before. It's kind of like watching paint dry at a certain point. You know it's going to happen. Just let it run. Plus, with the console output for this job, we can see everything that's happened anyways. So if I go into the console output here and then scroll down to our push container build step, you see it's running the workspace is C program files x86 Jenkins workspace, and that's the variable that we talked about earlier. Jenkins sets that at runtime. That's the folder that our job is running in. And then on the next line where we run the dir command, we see that it's running this step in the Azure Vote subdirectory of that. Go down a little bit further and we can see it's pulling up the credentials store and running a Docker login command with the username and password that was stored in that credentials pair. And then building the container from our workspace Azure Vote directory. Let's scroll down a little bit more until it finishes. And then pushed it up to Docker Hub. Let's cut over to Docker Hub and see if we can find it. All right, I'm here in Docker Hub, and let's go ahead and refresh the page. And you see we do have a new container there. If we go under tags, you see we pushed something just a couple of minutes ago under the latest tag. So now that we've got our container image in Docker Hub, let's see how we can pull it down and run it through some container scanning tools.